Thank you very much. Thank you for having me, and thank you for organizing this um, event. I wish we were all together in person and not remotely. But here we go. I was asked to do a couple of things. First is sort of introduce myself on a personal level. I was born in Somalia in 1969, so I am 56 years old, Gen X. And I think that my life is defined by the fact that I went through a number of transitions and a great deal of upheaval very quickly. So I was born in the year that Somalia was taken over by a dictatorship. So the Somali country became independent in 1961. For many Somalis at that time, that was a great change. All I can tell you about what I know of independence is just the really excited, almost breathless talks that the adults around me discussed. They loved the idea of independence. The British, the Italians, and the French were called oppressors. They were going to leave and they were going to put the responsibility for this brand new nation in the hands of Somalis themselves. So for those first 9 years, I think there was a very serious and very sincere attempt among Somalis to build a nation, sometimes with the help of the former colonizers, sometimes with what they thought was their own tradition of consultation, the religion of Islam, what they thought were the merits of their clans. In 1969, a young sergeant, Mohammed Siad Barre, and he was in the newly minted military of Somalia. He defected to the the Soviet Union, USSR, and with their help, he seized power. And in doing so, he was responding to a frustration among young people his age, which was this whole progress, this process of building a nation and maybe establishing a democracy. It was just taking too long. It was too frustrating. Maybe we could, speed things up. And he was speeding things up with the help of the Soviet Union, their 5-year plans. And again, I just cannot describe to you the upheaval that meant. For me and my family, it meant that my father was thrown into prison. It meant that for my mother, who could neither read nor write, her life as a wife was now going to prison to bring food to my father, looking after us, and entering into conspiracies on how to get us out of the country. And in 1977, I think, she managed to get me at the age of about 7 years old, my brother who was 13 months older, my sister who was 18 months younger, and my grandmother out of the country. We went into Saudi Arabia. For me, that was another upheaval, a new country, a new place. It almost was like a new universe, even though both Somalia and Saudi Arabia are Muslim countries, the experience was very, very dramatic. Saudi Arabia was governed by Sharia law, strict separation between men and women. In the 1970s, it was really a developing nation, even though it had all this oil money. So all the glitter and glamour you see now, it wasn't there. I remember the apartment that we went into the first few weeks of our life was so hot that we had, my little sister, brother, and me, we had these enormous blisters on our backs just from the heat. So that's how dramatic that was. And then soon after that, my family was deported. We went to Ethiopia. Again, a different country, different language, different culture. I think it was my first encounter with non-Muslims. And then in 1980, I was 10 years old. My family moved to Kenya again. New environment, everything new. And that's also where I learned English. I tell you this not because that was something unique that happened to me, but I think it was happening to multitudes of people across Africa, South Asia, Latin America. And so I am defined by that, maybe being accustomed to upheaval and change. And in 1992, I make my way to the Netherlands. And so for me, it was the first time to be really acquainted with the idea of stability. I remember asking some of the Dutch people that I got to know there, how long have you lived here? And they would say, my family was here for the last 300 years or the last 400 years. And that would make me think, my goodness, you can be in one place for 300 years or 400 years, and they could never think of, they really never understood the idea of, or, I did my first grade in Somalia and my second grade in Saudi Arabia and my third grade in Ethiopia and my fourth grade in Kenya. They just simply didn't understand that. So that's one part of my life. The second part of my life was during all of these upheavals, I was introduced to ideas, and I think my life was actually shaped by ideas. First was the idea that my father fell in love with, which was this idea of we can build a democracy in Somalia that's going to be unique, just like the Americans did. He went to America, he studied in America, and he was besotted with all things American to a certain extent. So there was that idea of we could achieve political freedom, we could make something of capitalism. He thought at the time that the best capitalists in the world were Somalis when it comes to selling things, negotiating, that type of those certain characteristics of capitalism, resilience, you name it. And then through the Soviet Union, the ideology, of course, of communism entered my life and entered Somali communities' life. So I was acquainted with communism not from books, not from movies, and I mean, all of that was there, but from real life experience. And so I've got to confess to all of you, I actually have a visceral hatred for communism because I experienced it in, uh, in almost all of its worst forms, talking of the body count, the famines, the promises shrouded in justice and equality that deliver hunger and brutality and cruelty. So I would say that is sort of my early years in Somalia, and then also later in Ethiopia, because Mengistu Haile Mariam, who was the local dictator in Ethiopia, was also a Soviet Union puppet and tried to do these accelerated changes, the 5-year plans. The third idea was Islamism. And even though we grew up as Muslims, and I was a Muslim up until the age of 15 without ever thinking.
I always wanted to do that.
And then they're like,
Sorry.
Sorry about that. Please mute your phones.
Yeah. The third idea for me was Islamism, and I was acquainted with it in 1985. And that came in the guise of the Muslim Brotherhood. The Muslim Brotherhood is, as you all know, by now, a transnational movement that promotes the idea that Islam is the solution to political problems, social problems, economic problems. Islam is the solution to all things. It seeks to revive the caliphate, which was abolished in 1924. And the leaders who promote this, all I can say for them, the most positive thing I can say about them is they truly, positively believe in that credo. And their timeline is very different. It is, we're going to revive the caliphate, and we're going to establish Islamic societies across the entire planet for as long as it takes. So you have this open-ended timeline. Like communists also, there's the use and sometimes the abuse of human beings as instruments to advance the ideology. So I was a teenager, and when 15 years old, 16 years old, in Nairobi, Kenya, and the people who are propagating this come into our communities. They do some really good things. They take young men, young idle men, off the streets. They give them a sense of meaning and purpose and identity. They, as a young woman, as a 15-year-old woman, they answered my questions about what's the whole point of life. And they said, this is the point of life. This is what you need to do. This is what you need to abstain from doing. They emphasized three things: obedience to Allah, to the Prophet Muhammad, to the Quran, and the scriptures. And then the second thing they emphasized was do not ask questions, just do it, do as you are told. And then the final and third thing was fear. And they presented it as not be afraid of me, but be afraid of God, because the punishment that God metes out for those who disobey is it's tough. So that's what shaped me. That's how I was formed until I come to the Netherlands. And arriving in the Netherlands in 1992. This is a very wealthy European country. It's secularizing. In 1992, the Dutch, like other Europeans, were celebrating the fall of communism. You know, I went to learn Dutch, and I went to study political science in Leiden. And there were two major things that were going on. This is in my 20s. There was the celebration of the fall of communism, and there was the reckoning with Nazism. And so in that microcosm of the Netherlands, I had become a Dutch citizen by that. I became a Dutch citizen in 1998. But I had opted to assimilate. So I felt I was like my fellow students, trying very much to do my best to learn from history what our teachers, our professors were trying to teach us, which was, as Dutch people, we behaved really badly during the Second World War and the lead up to the Second World War, because we sacrificed all, well, not all, but in terms of proportion to the population, the largest number of Jews. To Hitler, we fell without almost a fight. And as students, they were trying to instill into us the opposite of the three things that I had learned from the Muslim Brotherhood, which was always disobey, always ask questions, and never fear. And so I will say, if you ask me, the people who shaped my mind, my thinking, I'll say it was those professors at the University of Leiden. So when 9/11 2001 occurred, I applied exactly that. I thought those 19 men were motivated by their conviction. It's a conviction I knew and understood because I was a former member of the Muslim Brotherhood, and they were all members of the Muslim Brotherhood. Al-Qaeda, by the way, as you know, is a child of the Muslim Brotherhood. And so I was not going to obey my elders, these Dutch elders. I was with the center-left party at the time, and all of the wise men, wise women were saying, this has nothing to do with Islam. Ask questions. I kept asking questions, and that irritated people. That made people very angry. And I thought I was honoring my professors by just doing that, asking questions. And I was not going to be afraid. When the threats came from everywhere, I accepted the mitigation and the measures that were taken to keep me physically safe. But I didn't stop asking. I wasn't scared of the Islamists. I wasn't scared of being beheaded or being killed, or all the things that they were threatening to do. Later on, 10 years on, when I became a mother and a wife, and I had things to lose, I did become scared. So I don't want to go out there and say I was never scared. But those first 10 years from 9/11 2001, I wasn't scared, and I was disgusted at the people who were scared. I was disgusted at the leadership in countries like the Netherlands, who were wealthy, who had police forces and military forces and surveillance and security forces, and who were afraid of what seemed to me a bunch of juvenile young men who were shouting Allahu Akbar and seeking jihad. And I thought, how can you be afraid of these people? Don't you understand that if you appease, don't you understand that if you give in to these individuals, that things will only get worse? So fast 15 minutes, that is my story in a nutshell, until I come to America in 2006. And I think let's have a conversation about how that went about. But I came to America, full of prejudices, and the prejudices I harbored against America were mainly made in Holland and in Europe, which was Americans are fat, they carry guns, they are stupid. They meet every problem with bombs and B-52s, and they don't know what the art of subtlety is, they don't know what nuance is. And having now lived in America since 2006, I fiercely disagree with that. But sometimes I'll say, I also see a little bit of where the stereotype comes from. But now I'm an American, fully assimilated, and I bristle when Americans are attacked by non-Americans. So let's just put it that way. My clan sentiment, my clanism and amoral familism at the moment is in defending America and American heritage, and I think it's absolutely the greatest country in the world. And we need to keep it that way. So boomers, Gen Z, let's go.
Thank you, Ayaan. This was very inspiring. Thank you for your remarks today. And so let's open it up for questions. If you have questions, please raise your hand and I'll moderate the questions. I think Rick Schroeder wants to ask a question. Feel free, Rick Schroeder.
I was wondering about the parallelism between some of the recommendations that you associated with the Muslim Brotherhood. The fear that they were emphasizing, I think you said, was fear of God.
Yes.
The fear you were talking about when you were talking about Holland was not fear of God. It was fear of other people. It was fear of a movement. And would it not be reasonable to assume that the Muslim Brotherhood was also fearless at that level? I mean, their fear of God certainly didn't translate into a fear of others, because they're a proselytizing group trying to missionize. Takes a lot of courage to do the kinds of things they do at the secular level. So I was struck by your sense of it being an inversion. It strikes me that there's great similarity between the fearlessness that the Muslim Brotherhood shows with respect to their cause and the fearlessness you want to show with regard to your cause. And I wondered whether or not fear of God was totally absent in the secular Holland that you were in.
I think that's a great question. I think here is how you peel that onion. The Muslim Brotherhood are appealing to fear of God, which is fear of the transcendent. Mm-hmm. And as young people, what they were teaching us was life on earth is temporary and it's meaningless. It's only a transition process to eternal life. And so if you want eternal life and a blissful eternal life in paradise, you must not fear what is on earth. So their narrative is one of you have to rise above yourself. The fear that I told you I was disgusted by when I was in Holland, which was people threatening violence, and then we giving in to that, was fear that people's lives would be taken. Okay, so it's fear of what is going to happen on earth. So the government of the Netherlands says our job is to make sure that there are zero homicides. Obviously, we can't achieve that. And if we have now an emerging ideology where people are going to be beheaded, like my friend Theo van Gogh, whose life was taken, the response was, we don't want any of that. And so maybe we have to find some kind of middle ground. We used to call this consensus, where on the one hand, we appease those who are threatening aggression, and on the other hand, we try and assert our values, and we kind of find a middle ground. I was disgusted by that because I thought, then you don't understand the nature of aggressors at all. Because when you give a little, obviously, an aggressor thinks, especially one who believes in the transcendent, thinks, I can take more. They count that as a victory. And I want to say that's the trajectory where the Netherlands, but also other European countries are at. I don't think the appeasement has paid off. I think they've put themselves in a terrible conundrum. And then the third piece is the fear that I felt as a person years later, again, when I, on a personal level, felt I had something to lose. I was putting possibly my husband in danger or my children in danger, or even if I didn't put them in danger, because I understand the rules of Sharia, I am the blasphemer. I am the one who left Islam. So I'm the primary target of members of the Muslim Brotherhood, not my family. But that also put me in a state of mind of fear by saying, well, then I leave my children without a mother. I leave my husband without a wife. That makes me irresponsible. That has me then trying to balance public life with private life. And there's that level of fear. But I think those of us who are committed to preserving life and who think life on earth is precious, these are the two types of fears we have, which I think the Muslim Brotherhood definitely does not have, because when the Muslim Brotherhood preach and they're confronted with questions like, what about my family? If I join Al-Qaeda or ISIS, if I blow people up and they come for me, what if my family also gets blown up? And the teacher will say, the imam will say, but that's a blessing for your family. You all go to paradise. So this is, I think, the different perspectives on human fear and human.
So are you drawing it? I'm sorry, your points about appeasement are very powerful, but I'm just wondering whether the point you're making doesn't distinguish Islam from Christianity, for example, because everything you said has very strong voices historically in Christianity. Its relationship to the transcendent, its missionary aspirations, its preference for a heavenly world to this world. Leave your family behind and follow me. It strikes me that we're talking here about a certain view of maybe theocracy, whether it's Islam or Christian theocracies, but not a contrast between Islam and the West. I mean, the West has strong Christian missionary traditions. Even secular humanism is a universalizing ideology that thinks we are the best and the world will be better off if they were just like us, and has spent an enormous amount of hard and soft power trying to spread a West is best kind of ideology. So at the level you're talking about, it strikes me that they're very similar.
I'm a brand new Christian. I converted to Christianity just 2 years ago, and this conversion also led me to actually reading the Bible and discovering the life and times of Jesus and the early church, and then what came about beyond that. And I think superficially speaking, yes, there are similarities. Yes, there's a commitment to the transcendent, but at least biblically speaking, the New Testament onwards, there is there's no commandment, there's no edict that says that if you bring the gospel to people who do not know about the gospel, you are asked, yes, many times urged, encouraged to spread the gospel. But in doing so, and yes, Christianity, just like Islam, has universalist pretensions. But in doing so, there is no case to be made to kill people if they were to reject Christianity. So that's a major difference. In Christianity also, at least according to the Gospels, according to the teachings of Jesus Christ, there is this radical separation of church and state. And so it is not up to the government to impose Christianity on others. You might say over the centuries, various governments did try to promote through government means Christianity. That is true. But biblically speaking, Christianity was born during the Roman Empire, and Jesus is on the record saying, "Unto Caesar's what is Caesar's," and so on. There are some of these also very draconian punishments that do not feature in Christianity. In fact, Christianity basically abolishes those draconian punishments. The one that comes to mind is the flogging, the stoning of the adulterers. Cast the first stone if you have no sin. And then the woman who is a sinner is told, go off now and sin no more. The Christian dogma, I think, is summarized in the love God with all your heart, your mind, your strength, and love thy neighbor. And that's not in Islam. So those two different cultures have spawned different empires, they have spawned different ways of life. And I think maybe, on a different session, we can talk about that, but they're radically different. And I think the big, at least the last 3 or 4 decades, I think that what we have done in the West, in America and Europe and other Western countries, was to turn our backs on Christianity and to adopt superficially the idea that all these religions are the same. They are not.
Okay. So I want to give priority to new participants. So Terry Andresen, feel free to ask your question.
Hi, Ayaan. It's so great to see you. You wrote a couple days ago a piece in the Free Press explaining how the fraud in Minnesota happened and why it happened. And I actually am born and raised in Minnesota. And I'd like to ask you, what does Minnesota do now going forward with the largest Somali population outside of Somalia?
Terry, thank you very much. And thank you for all your support, by the way, both to Hoover and UATX. I didn't know you were born in Minnesota. I think what's happening in Minnesota is there are 2 different scams that are underway. There's the Somali scam, the Somalis who cluster. I referenced Edward Banfield's book, where Edwin Banfield was a sociologist, and he publishes this book. I think it was The Moral Backwardness of Societies, What Keeps Societies Backward. And he studies a small Italian community in Sicily, I believe. It's a while ago since I read the book, but he discovers this incredible and intense loyalty to the nuclear family. So intense it becomes pathological. And I think that's where the ISM is added to the word family, familism, amoral familism. And this amoral familism prevents this particular community from investing in anything, any kind of collaboration outside of the family. Obviously, it's not only that particular community in Italy. This pattern, you could see this in several different communities across the world, and I totally see it in among Somalis. I saw this in 2008 when a friend gave me that book, and I thought, this is exactly what's wrong with us, and how should we come out of this? So Minnesota is being confronted with a Somali community that is coming from, as I told you, the upheaval that shaped my early life. And that upheaval only got worse and worse. If you had stayed in Somalia, then you also experienced the civil war. So the only group of people you could really rely on was your family or your clan. And And so in Minnesota, they're replicating that, and they're replicating the mistrust towards anything exterior of that, including the state. You cannot trust these people. The expectation that everybody in relationship to the state, the nation state or the Minnesota state, is there to extract from what is being foolishly given. And so when I diagnose that problem, I don't want to condemn the Somalis. I want to say it is the Minnesotans and the Americans who failed to explain to them, you are now no longer in Somalia, and none of that applies. You're now in America, and this is how we ought to behave. So that is one system of scam. Then the other one is, of course, I'm afraid to say this, but the Democratic Party, which is not different from other center-left parties that I see in Europe, which has come to rely on this ethnic vote, and they feel that they have figured out if we look away from certain things or give in to certain things, make certain exemptions, we are guaranteed this vote, and we don't have to work as hard as we used to work before, which was to go and persuade voters of our, I don't know, economic or social or whatever programs that we think is the best solution to whatever the problem is that the voters are facing. So you have these two groups, and I think that's what's happening in Minnesota. I think Doge, established by Elon Musk, he has stepped aside, but I think there's something of Doge left in the administration, is going to go after this and will ask the right questions. And for me, the most persistent question for the economists here is, how can we build systems in the 21st century that are geared towards this kind of heterogeneity, these types of scams? And so I think what you're seeing in Minnesota is we have a system, a welfare benefits system, a political system that was built for a different time. And it is, how do we reform that, and how do we make it accountable for everyone?
Great. Erik Rasmussen.
Yes, I just put in Adam Smith's The Theory of Moral Sentiments, which is a book you'd like if you haven't read it. I like Banfield also, and I think the natural state of mankind is to only care about your family or your village. So really, Somalia is more the ordinary and America is the oddity.
Yes.
But Christianity has made a big difference with that, because it was universal. It was, don't care just about Jews, but about everybody. Is there any way Christianity could be made to appeal to the Somalis in Minneapolis? How would you appeal to Somalis to look seriously into Christianity?
I think that what you said just now is the question that should have been asked 30 years ago. It's not only how should we do it, but we should have done it. So that is what we have neglected to do, not just with Somalis, but with everyone else who comes from a broken society. When you rescue people, let me stick with the Somalis. Let's take our most famous Somali congresswoman, Ilhan Omar. To the extent that her father was of Siad Barre's regime, the civil war occurs, she's in a refugee camp. She's a child. And she's rescued out of that by the Americans, and she and her family are resettled somewhere in America. There you have to ask the question that maybe Adam Smith would have asked prior to the rescuing, which is, if we Americans, we are the odd ones out, America is the exceptional country, if we're going to go out of our way to rescue people from Hobbesian circumstances, are we only going to offer them food and shelter and welfare benefits and Medicaid, etc.? Is that the bread of life? Or are we going to give them something more special, what makes us special? Which is, that was the time when we should have told and asked the questions, why do you think your country failed? Why do you think clanism fails? Why do you think that The Soviet narrative of communism failed. We didn't do any of that. We just kept showering them with material benefits without explaining where all that comes from, and said, we're Americans, we're generous, and you can use the story of the founding fathers whenever it suits you. Today you're an anti-Semite, but tomorrow you can say, oh, Donald Trump, the 1930s. You can manipulate the story of America at any given moment so that you can extract something materially out of it. But we actually failed to rescue them morally. And we failed to give them what is morally superior. That is my take now.
John.
Somebody here says the Lutherans should have evangelized Mali arrival. I completely agree with that.
Well, thank you for this wonderful talk. I'll answer your economist question. Of course, reforming the social programs in part to destroy through perfectly legal means, they destroy all sorts of incentives, not just the scams. So we need to do that. But I think part of the answer is enforce, which to the credit of the Minnesotans, they actually did enforce. So the question I want to ask is more about Europe and the UK now, which seems to be in the grips of Islamophobia, a complete surrender. This is not the Reconquista, the Battle of Lepanto. This is simply lay down your swords and let them in. At least in my Twitter stream, the penalties for insulting Islam in Europe are worse than the penalties for the rape of the woman who insulted the Islamist. Why don't we ask for assimilation? The center-left blob that has run our countries, at least until recently, completely doesn't believe in Western civilization, capitalism, and all the wonderful things. So how could you possibly demand that people come and assimilate? At least that's the way it seems from here. So I'm curious your view on just how bad things are in the UK. Of course, there is the peasants with pitchforks are out there voting for reform, and other political movements that are very incoherent at the moment, but certainly represent a reaction against that completely failed and self-immolating center-left blob. Is that how it's going to get fixed, or is there a better way that it's going to get fixed? And just how bad are things in Europe and the UK?
Things are very bad in Europe and in the UK, really bad. I mean, they don't have a Bill of Rights, they don't have a Declaration of Independence, they don't have a constitution, they don't have any of the protections that we have in the United States, where in the United States we can go around and say, oh, we're not a democracy, we're a republic. And in fact, the way our constitution was drafted, it inoculated us against excesses of democracy. So they don't have any of that. And so here they're dealing with literally the consequences of demographics, where they insisted over a long time, whatever you say, democracy, democracy, democracy. So now you get the majority rule. And if majority rule is, it leads you down the drain, then there seems to be no protections against it. Having said that, I think, John, that you are alluding to, it's just the perspectives as, when you mention center-left or leftist narratives and ideologies, I ask myself, where was the right in the last 30 years or the last 40 years? Why did the right not publicize enough? Why did we not fight back? I mean, by the way, in the 1990s, I was very much on the left because all my professors were on the left. But where was...
Just to clarify, I was counting UK conservatives strike me as part of the same center-left blob.
The center-left blob, but the conservatives, the UK conservatives, like the conservatives everywhere else on the continent, they were tugged to the left, just as Hayek had predicted in his essay, Why I Am Not a Conservative. Because conservatism became stuffy, it became unfashionable, it became a belief system for white, old, stale male men who gathered in clubs, in fancy clubs, and adhered to fancy manners and so on. And so while the legacy was being abolished by the left, the right was nowhere to be found and were nowhere to be seen. So as we reflect on where we are, I think that you will end up saying the left cannot be blamed for pursuing what they believe in, which is an international or global communist redistribution narrative that they think is going to usher in utopia. But luckily, there are lots and lots of people who started out on the left who have now figured out that maybe this is not the right way to go. And so there is an opportunity for self-correction. And I think that's where your question is headed, which is, do these countries even have an opportunity to self-correct? To which I can say a country like Denmark does. A country like the UK, I don't know. And it always comes back to that question of demographics.
Okay. Bill Fraser.
Okay, I think I'm unmuted. Ayaan, thank you so much for speaking with us today. I have a two-part question, and I'll only ask you to address the first part now and perhaps give some thoughtful reflection on the second part later. The first question is, do you believe Islam is compatible with liberal democracy? And I'll tee that question up with the second part, which is we at the MIT Free Speech Alliance hold a debate twice a year on contentious issues, and our objective is to model thoughtful, reasonable debate on these issues. And the topic we've chosen for the spring is resolved. Islam is not compatible with liberal democracy. And we don't take a position on that, but that's what we'd like to see debated. And in your overstuffed inbox, you will find an invitation from us to come and lead the affirmative debate team. So if you can address the issue now and then go think about, please, accepting our invitation, we could follow up later.
Islam is not compatible with democracy. Full stop. Again, if you take the trouble to understand what Islam means, Islam simply is, it is submission to the will of Allah. Where do you find that? You find that in the Quran, Hadith, the scripture, and Islamic practice over the course of 1,500 years. At the core of Islam is human beings are not allowed to make laws, which is incompatible with this secular idea that, people gather and they figure out what their interests and their problems are, and they produce laws that a majority, or I don't know, those who represent them, that they ratify, and then from then on, that is the law. So those are man-made laws. So that is a first thing that I think Islam truly rejects. Now, there is a distinction between Islam as a doctrine, as a way of life, as tradition, as a civilization, from individual Muslims. There are individual Muslims, and I think many of them truly vote with their feet when they come to places like the West, where they're looking for material comforts, opportunities, stability, economic and military and security gains. And in doing so, they're either defying Islam or they make the argument that, and they take this from Islamic scripture, when Islam is in a position of weakness, you're allowed to behave a certain way. When Islam is in a position of strength, then you're obligated to behave in a certain way, and so on. And so I think that is what you're seeing. And so you will hear both arguments. You will hear the state, Islam is a religion of peace, Islam is compatible with democracy, Islam is all that you want it to be. You will hear all of that, but that is speaking from a place where Islam is not dominant. But when those who are pushing for Islamist doctrine, when they get their way, all of that gets upended and Sharia law gets introduced. So that is the answer. And then the second bit is in terms of free speech. No, there is no free speech in Islam because you're not allowed to ask questions. You only have to obey and you have to fear God. Those are the three cardinal, I would say, pillars of Islam. So there's no free speech. There's no, I think that I can't say to, why do you as a male have more rights than I have? When I asked that as a teenager, I was told you cannot ask those questions because the mere fact of asking the question is sinning. You're disobeying God, you're rebelling against God. So there's no free speech. There's no critical thinking. And yes, I'm delighted to come to MIT and talk to your students.
John Staddon.
Hi. Yeah, thank you so much, Ayaan, for all of the work you've been doing. I'm enormously impressed by it. I want to follow up on John Cochrane's question about Britain. My YouTube channel is flooded with anti-Islam people. And I notice there's kind of a class thing in it, as well as a religious thing. For example, there's a fellow called Tommy Robinson, I'm sure you've heard of him, who's
Yes.
totally demonized, and he had a rough beginning, I understand. But do you have any insight into the problem, the class relation to this whole thing? I mean, he was a pioneer in pointing out these Pakistani rape gangs and so on, got nothing for it, was in prison for various things. He's obviously a rather violent fellow, or was when he was younger. Do you have any insights into what's going on over there?
I do. Tommy Robinson grew up in Luton, and this is a suburb of London, which is home or used to be home to England's working classes. And I don't know how much you know about the United Kingdom, but it's a class society.
Yeah, I'm English originally, so.
Oh, yes, yes, yes. So where Somalis, for instance, are clans, I can tell you all the different clans and the animosities. When you come to the UK, it's all about the different classes. And then in every region, then every class. So they have this whole class thing. And Tommy Robinson is what once upon a time used to be called lower class and now is called working class, politely and euphemistically.
You're right.
And when all of this whole mad mass migration occurred, the people that really shouldered the burden of the unintended negative consequences of mass migration are those working classes. It's their neighborhoods, it's their towns, it's their jobs, it's their services. They are the ones who became truly overburdened. Now, my acquaintance, I've never met Tommy Robinson in person, but I followed him over the years and listened very closely. And I try and sidestep accusations of racism and bigotry and far right, this, that, and the other, because I know that's always, someone is always trying to obscure something when they use those labels. And what I found was that, again, in terms of the overburdening, when it comes to the negative consequences of immigration, it was these young women in working class neighborhoods that were being, and they were children. We're talking at this point about some of them are 11-year-olds, 12-year-olds, being lured into what only really can be termed as gang rapes by men in their 20s and in their 30s and even in their 40s. And something along these lines happens to a relative of his, I think it's a cousin. And as the young, I mean, in any kind of context, men like Tommy Robinson would go, if we were in Somalia, they would take spears and swords and knives and they would shoot the people who were doing that. But living in the UK, that doesn't happen. So what he does is he starts to agitate against it and organize against it. And he's doing this in a context when there was a political consensus that we do not talk about these things because that would amount to racism. So in that sense, I actually do admire Tommy Robinson because I think he stood up for his class, he stood up for the young girls and women in his class, and he endured the persecution against him. Now, there are all sorts of accusations made against him of roughing people up and fighting and what people do, what young men do. And I'm perfectly prepared to forgive him for all of that because of his persistence in saying, if the Muslim community, they want to settle in Luton and they want to become like us, then they should be held accountable for the things that they are doing wrong. And they were not held accountable. They were let down by the various elites who are trying now to demonize Tommy Robinson. But I think it goes back again to the question that John Cochrane asked. It's part of it is, it's in some ways even counterproductive to talk about what immigrants do right and wrong. Whereas I think we should talk perhaps more about what it is that the leaders of the host society, you know, all the things that they haven't been held accountable for. That I think that's much more, if you're going to invite half the world to come in, you then better have a robust system that can withstand that. And we didn't have robust systems. We had very fragile systems. We still do, because these fragile systems, to go back to Christianity, they were very much based on trust. And there was an assumption that if people are coming from other parts of the world and they come here, they want to be like us. And I think that assumption has been proven wrong. The assumption of multiculturalism, if Western societies, host societies, were generous enough to say to the people who are coming, you can keep your culture while you also adapt to our culture. I mean, that kind of, you can have your cake and you can eat it too nonsense. It's now proving that that's not how reality works. So the more detached our elites have been from reality in the last 4 or 5 decades, the higher the price we pay. And the people who are paying the true price of this elite irresponsibility and unaccountability are the people who belong to the classes of Tommy Robinson. And therefore, I shall never condemn Tommy Robinson. I'm sorry, I do not think he's a vile man.
Thank you for that. I come to much the same view. Poor old Tommy, he talks like this. He don't talk posh, And I think that prejudices people totally. He's slandered all the time. Anyway, thank you so much for that.
You're welcome.
I wanted to ask you about this concept of assimilation, which is a concept that makes a lot of Westerners a little bit uncomfortable because it has this connotation of forcing your values, your ideas onto the people that come to your country. And so it's a bit, I mean, it sounds a bit illiberal to some people. So in your view, what is sort of a meaningful assimilation policy? And second, do you think it's even worthwhile trying assimilating certain groups, or you feel that maybe the policy is to just not let them in at all?
For me, assimilation means that there are 3 components to assimilation. There's identity, there's belonging, and then most importantly of all, there's loyalty.
Mm-hmm.
And these 3 things, I think they come together. What is your identity? Where do you belong? What are you loyal to? Here's the thing. You cannot be loyal to 2 masters. You cannot be loyal to multiple identities. So when you come from elsewhere, and the more different you are, the harder it is. If you're an Eastern European coming to Western Europe, yes, you do have to contend with, who am I? Where do I belong? And am I loyal or not loyal? But generally speaking, the culture practiced in Eastern Europe is not so radically different from Western Europe. But if you're coming from Somalia or Syria or Afghanistan or Nigeria and you come to the West, these things are really different. And so that we never had, I think we had a very dishonest solution called multiculturalism, which was you can keep those radically different loyalties, identities, an idea of belonging, which then we encourage the clustering of these ethnicities in various urban settings. And then we subsidized that through the welfare system, and we still do that. So we lied to ourselves, we lied to the people who are coming. It doesn't work. For me, assimilation is on an individual level and maybe to a certain extent, family and collective level, where you say, I have now time. I'm not going back to Somalia again. I'm not going to live there. I'm not going to raise my children. My future lies in America. Therefore, my loyalty and identity and belonging lies there. And so I'm going to learn everything I can as fast as I can. And I'm going to demonstrate myself. And, there's a great deal of competition. You're not just coming from Somalia. People are coming from all over the world. I'm going to demonstrate to the host society, here is where I belong. I see groups who have done that over time. Jewish communities have done that. The Irish communities, the Italians. Today we see the Indians, the Chinese, people who contribute in ways that, are just so gigantic. Look at the Indian community. And they say, look at us, look at us. We see how much we love America. They may eat their curry. They may put their little dot on there. They may have but they're actually demonstrating here is where they want to belong. Here's where they want to contribute. And I think that's what we need to encourage. And we should stop lying to ourselves, and we should stop lying to immigrants. You cannot belong in two different places. It's like polygamy. It never works.
Do we have time for 2 or 3 more questions, Ayaan?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. Okay, David and then Paulina.
Thanks. I very much enjoyed your talk, and I wrote this out, and I just thought I'd mention it, and then I have an answer to one of your questions. I remember reading you saying that when Muslims found out you weren't a believer, they wanted to kill you. But when Christians found out you weren't a Christian because you hadn't become a Christian yet, they said they would pray for you. Pretty big difference. So on the, oh, and by the way, I'm from Canada, and I am a loyal American. And I remember the guy who started this whole mess was Trudeau the Elder, when he kept talking about the Canadian mosaic. And so the idea is you could just fit these things in rather than a melting pot.
Yeah.
I'm an economist, and I want to take a shot at answering your thing. John Cochrane got to it a bit, but I want to say a little more about it. I think the key in the extreme is not to have a welfare state. In other words, to have private voluntary charity. Now, that's hard to achieve. Short of that, it's to really rein in the welfare state. And I think one thing that makes America work with Muslims better than France is 2 things. One is we don't subsidize public housing to the same extent. So we don't get those things ringing Paris where it's just horrible. The second is we don't have as many labor market restrictions. So the high minimum wage in France, but more important, the law that says when you hire someone, you can't fire them after a fairly short period, a year or 2, makes employers not willing to hire. And so you have a whole lot of young men looking around and getting into mischief. So in other words, I don't have the solution to get their culture better. But I do think that just those 2 changes in itself would do it, even if they don't change many of their beliefs. And I wonder what you think of that.
Well, I think I completely agree with you. The mosaic thing, it's like the Trudeau family, the ivory tower kind of thing, where people sit in academic settings and they imagine all sorts of realities. I think Thomas Sowell, a wonderful, prestigious colleague has put this just so succinctly. They have these imagined ideas that they're always good. You can always be generous with other people's money.
Mm.
So I think we're living with the consequences of those imagined realities. And so here we are in America, and I think the election of November 2024 was a rejection of that mosaic. It was a rejection of that detachment from reality. It was close the borders. We have to freeze immigration, especially low-skilled type immigrants. So there's a correction mechanism underway, but obviously it's going to take quite a bit of time before we see the results of that. Now, on the minimum wage thing, to you and John Cochrane, blue states like California and Massachusetts, and to a certain extent, I think even Minnesota and New York, Illinois, all of these blue states, they can go around and they can beat about on their chest and they can say that they have a minimum wage, and they can have their minimum wage anywhere from $10 to $50, whatever they fantasize a minimum wage ought to be. But what they're looking away from is what is being done to the illegal communities within the same ethnic minorities. So when you read about a Somali small business, that Somali small business is not paying its employees the minimum wage that is required in San Diego or in Minnesota or in Colorado. No, they have a number of undocumented fellow Somalis to whom they say, I'm going to pay you $3, so I'm going to pay you nothing. You do the work. And that illegal person is trapped. They don't want to go back to Somalia. They either go to do the work or they're going to be turned over to the authorities. That is what we call modern day slavery. That modern day slavery is how that underclass economy is run. And I don't know what you formal economists say about that and how you quantify that. Because you can go all over the place saying, oh, look at these ethnic communities. They're starting small businesses. Yes, they are. But who works for them? What hours? What are they paid? What are their conditions? How old are they? What sectors do they work in? And so on. Human exploitation of every kind, sexual exploitation, domestic exploitation, just human rights abuses in America, in Europe, in the UK, and then the same states, the people who say, oh, we're good, we're great, we have minimum wages, we are, my name is Gavin Newsom and I'm the best human being on the planet. But on my watch, all of this is happening in this black market of illegals, and I'll just keep, I'll keep marketing this idea that more immigration is needed.
Well, just really quick response, because I know there are other people waiting. I think the key in what you said, though, was that they're illegal, because that's the threat. That's the threat, to send them back. If you legalize it, and the thing is, I think it's great to have way more low-skilled workers come in, and there's a really good literature on it that they don't hurt badly at all the wages of Americans.
But it's if they have the opportunity to say, screw you, I'm going to go work for $4 an hour at the gas station that's an American company with, American labor laws, that's their way out. And that's what we deny them. Ayan's exactly right. The legal system keeps them tied into the community of exploitation.
Right.
And that would also mean that's why you'd have to be against clustering, because you see, besides the economic arguments, there's also the social cohesion. So a lot of people are afraid, when I talk about a domestic worker who's working for nothing, she might be an orphan child working for her own aunt. And how is she going to turn her own aunt to the authorities or run away from that? And she's an illegal. Can you imagine the level of vulnerability that is going on there? So it's very much layered. And I think it's good that we're having this conversation. And it's great that economists like you are having this conversation, because maybe we can make a case to emancipate those people and get them out of that situation of slavery, really slavery.
Really quick, I do a Substack. May I quote something you said as long as I quote you exactly?
Quote me, absolutely.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah,
Because I want to address that.
it's
it
an
is
honor.
an opinion type question. Thank you.
Okay, and our last question, Paulina.
Dear Jan, thank you so much for all you do. You're a really inspiring person, and you're truly one of the most courageous person. I wonder, what is your opinion about why nowadays it seems that communist Marxist ideology and radical Islamism sort of entered in a stage of romance? So I was born in Soviet Union, and my opinion about communism is 100% the same as yours. But it's strange that both ideology and they try for the world domination. Philosophically, they're quite different. Communists don't believe in afterlife. They're not spiritual, right? They willing sacrifice people, but not for the gaining access to paradise. While radical Islamism, this cult of fear, seems to be based on the afterlife, some afterlife promises. So why do you think those two ideologies coexist and support each other?
Well, first of all, I think they're both man-made. They've constructed utopias. So they do coexist one another. But I think where they really coincide, the expediency is that political freedom, they hate Christianity, they hate the American way of life. They've convinced themselves that if they bring down America, if they bring down the societies that were built on the things that they hate, political freedom plus capitalism, then their utopias will be realized. So if you look at the Islamists in the Middle East, Israel has to be brought down. Why? Because Israel has political freedom and it's a market system. And so if you get Israel out of the way, then the utopia will be realized. That's what the Islamists in Iran believe. And that's why they want to develop a nuclear bomb and get Israel out of the way. And then they can move on to the big Satan, which is Israel is a little Satan. The big Satan is America. But I think the question really is, why are American young people, like the people who voted for Mamdani, the people who voted for Ocasio-Cortez and other members of the squad, why are young American people, especially those educated in the Ivy League, why are they falling for these bad ideas? Why are they falling for communism? So education comes, I think, in two ways. One is through experience, and then the second one is through the classroom. Obviously, the best is a combination of experience and classroom. And what we've done is, after 1989, after the fall of the Soviet Union, Americans and other Westerners did not experience communism. They don't know what communism is. They know it only from books. But books were no longer published, movies no longer made. The cultural institutions that were supposed to tell the story over and over again, just like we told the story of National Socialism, just didn't do it. And that is my beef with the center-right, is they stopped talking about communism when they thought communism was over. And then what happened is that now we come to the classroom, is what is it that was happening in the classroom from K to 12 and in universities? We allowed these people to take over the hearts and minds of young people and tell them about, seduce them with communism. What did Ilhan Omar and Ocasio-Cortez and Mamdani and Tlaib and all these people, what do they have in common? The answer is this: Mamdani may have been born in Uganda, but he went to school in America. Ilhan Omar was born in Somalia, but she went to school in America. AOC went to school in America, not in Puerto Rico. So the fact that these people's heads are filled with garbage is our fault. It's American universities and learning. That's where they got educated with communism. That's a huge paradox. It's the world's greatest capitalist city elected a socialist, a man who calls himself a socialist, who got his socialism from the University of Columbia. So who are we going to blame?
Thank you, Ayaan. There is one last question, Eric.
Yes, well, blame the professors, of course, like us.
Yes.
And I was going to go back to your professors because you said your university professors taught you three things, and one of them was to ask questions. And I wondered, did they like you asking questions of them, or do they mean just to ask questions of authorities in society?
They also encouraged me to ask questions of them. So we were graded on the more questions you asked, the more critical you were of a text, and the higher your grades.
Oh, yes, but how about if you were critical of the professor?
They were fine with that.
They were. Oh, that's good.
We didn't allow professors, we were not allowed to call them by their first names unless he gave you permission, he or she gave you permission to say, call me by my first name, which is very rare. We were also not allowed to be disrespectful to professors and I've seen some of terrible behavior from students towards professors in America. None of that was allowed. The threat of suspension and expulsion was always there. You had to, you had to meet your deadlines. You had to have a certain number of points in a given year, 42 points in a given year. You had to have at least 21, or your school fees would freeze. We didn't have what we have in America, which was in America you have to pay these incredible amounts of money, but the government provided your school fees, your college fees, university fees until the age of 25. And then after the age of 25, you borrowed, but it was such a tiny amount. But you could lose that money if you didn't meet your points. So there was a system in place that encouraged learning, critical thinking. You learned how to think. And yes, you challenged your professors, but you didn't challenge your professors. You were allowed to challenge your professors and your fellow students as long as it was not ad hominem. You had to stick to the issue.
Okay, good.
Thank you very much, Ayaan. This was great. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.